Okay, let's get started. Corliss, let's
All
begin.
right, I am ready. What is implicit bias? It is influenced by attitudes and stereotypes that we all hold based on our experiences. It influences how we act in a subconscious way, even if we renounce prejudices or stereotypes in our daily lives. It can be favorable and unfavorable assessments deep in our subconscious, and it can indicate that we tend to favor our own in group, the social group to which we psychologically identify as belonging. Research indicates that we can disfavor our own in group.
Okay, let's hit up the chat. What are some buzzwords, keywords that we want to tie to our understanding? Okay, I see attitudes and stereotypes. I see disfavor. So we tend to
Yep.
look at it as rather negative, right? Are there any other terms from this definition that we want to pull up? The subconscious, right? It's things that we do without thinking.
Stereotypes.
Hmm? Thank you so much. I think in all the times we facilitate this workshop, we tend to talk about these implicit bias as if, because it's so subtle that it's sort of innocent, like a little small minor issue. But I want to posit a question to the team to think about. Uh, why is it dangerous? Why is implicit bias dangerous? Anybody want to take a stab and come off mute?
Because it's based off of attitudes and stereotypes. Maybe sometimes you can treat someone unfairly because of that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, it leads you to make assumptions about people, about their motivations, about their capabilities.
Mm-hmm. I found a quote that I want to share with the team that's going to tie together what you guys just shared about why it's dangerous. It's not just a tiny minor misbehavior. This quote I found says, implicit bias is even more pernicious in our society because of its invisibility. It is impossible to address a problem that no one will admit they have. Yet, as research shows, implicit bias can impact nearly every aspect of life for a marginalized person, from how their teachers view them in preschool, to how their doctors understand their pain, to whether they get a call back for a job. Individual teachers, doctors, hiring managers, and others do not have to make consciously racist decisions in order for racism to thrive, which is why implicit bias must be addressed as a key issue in anti-racist work. I thought that was pretty profound, and I'll put it up. We often think about, and protect the person who is inflicting or enacting the implicit bias, but I'm always going to be pushing us to think about the person who receives the bias and how it impacts their lives. All right.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you so much for people participating. So I like to bring it home, right? And I like to get personal. I'm a sports enthusiast. I always say in my next lifetime, I'm going to be a sports pundit on ESPN. So I'm at home getting ready for the NCAA tournament, and I'm super pumped for both men's and women's. And I just want you to take a look at the weight room for the men, and then the weight room for the women. And I want you to think about, right, like these are premier D1 athletes trying to go pro, trying to win championships for their teams. So if you were preparing for this championships, which room would you prefer? Like, take gender away. If you're just looking at this room, both pictures, where would you want to prepare, right? And I just want to name and normalize that this is implicit bias at its highest level, right? Because implicit bias is when stereotypes and assumptions affect our decisions, like player development. There's an implicit bias around female athletes, right? Like when we think, we allow women to play sports, but we really think it's like a man's world. And this is very evident in saying like, wow, here's all the things that the men need to be successful in this tournament. And they disgustingly gave women a rack of dumbbells. Like my heart dropped and I was like, wow. And this is why we have to address implicit bias, because it's not only personal. Sure, the women who have worked all of their life to get to this moment felt a deep personal disgust by it, but it's systemic. The NCAA as a system, right, made a decision to say we are going to invest all of these resources in the power of men, right, and then just give women the bare minimum because we expect, right, this unconsciousness that women need less than men. So I just wanted to like frame that like it's not only just personal, it's also systemic.
Burrell, I don't know if you saw the chat, but someone, Vera, posed the question of whether, I'm going to read your question, Vera, is implicit bias hereditary, homegrown, or passed on? And I said, you're going to address that in just a second with our SMOG, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So what I want us to do, thank you for that question and thank you for engaging in the chat. I want us to think and write. Think about an experience you've had involving implicit bias, ideally at your institution. I'm not saying you have to, but we want us to think about like where we are. I want you to tell me what happened. What was the impact? And what role does identity play in this experience? Because I know for marginalized people, we are often the victims of implicit bias. So I want you to get super vulnerable with yourself. Talk about that experience you've had with implicit bias. What happened? What was the impact? And what role did identity play in this experience? And I'll put the timer on for 4 minutes. Thank you so much. That is time. I just want to say, I always appreciate when people dig deep and think and write about vulnerable experiences. I would love for someone to take themselves off of mute and share, but I also realize that talking about implicit bias, especially for people of color, can be very triggering. So I ask us to lean into our norms, to listen first, to understand, and to assume the best. So I would love for someone to take themselves off of mute and share with the group to discuss what happened, what was the impact, and what role did identity play in this implicit bias experience?
I'll share an experience. I actually have two.
Thank
but
you
the
so
first,
much.
You're welcome. The first one is about race. So I worked with a group of ladies. It's been several years ago, and we had all at that point become friends. And had worked together for several years. And we were all just happened to be talking about marriage. As ladies tend to do sometimes, and spouses. And the conversation came up about how many partners you'd had. And one lady said to me, "Oh, I just assumed that you'd had several." And I was the only Black woman in the group. And I, uh, in my head, said a lot of things, and out loud asked what that assumption was, why she would make that assumption. And she couldn't give me a response. But it was that idea, knowing her of Black women, this idea or stereotype that we're promiscuous and those types of things. And so, of course, she denied it was that at all. But knowing her and knowing some of the stereotypes that she has had of other Black people, it really stuck with me. And I later tried to address it and she didn't, but it was a very frustrating situation because it also tied in some of the other ways that she treated me in regards to considering me being aggressive or, it's just that stereotype of Black women. And it did at a point create a huge issue in our working relationship. And then the other is constantly my age. People always assuming that because of my age, I don't know enough, which is always interesting in education.
Wow. First, thank you so much for sharing that. I can't imagine, right? Like the pain behind it, because I'm sure that unfortunately was probably not your first experience with implicit bias as a Black woman, right? And I'm sure it hurt deeply personal, but I want to lean into like, not only was it personal, it was systemic because it began to impact your working relationship. So if she thinks that you are promiscuous or aggressive as a Black woman, like, does she see you as a value asset? Are you the next person to get promoted when it's time for that promotion? Is it really about meritocracy or about how you view Black women? So thank you so much for sharing. When I think about implicit bias, I love Dr. Beverly Tatum, who captures this perfectly. She is a renowned scholar, professor, president at the illustrious Spelman College for Black women. And she said in her book, if we have all been breathing in smog, we can't help but have our thinking shaped by it somehow. As a consequence, we all have work to do. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter. We have all been exposed to misinformation that we have to think critically about. To say that it is not our fault does not relieve us of responsibility, however. We may not have polluted the air, but we need to take responsibility along with others for cleaning it up. Dr. Beverly Tatum, right? I would say this quote is so profound because she's naming, right, like that we all breathe the smog. And I just want to name and normalize for this session. We have all probably been victims of implicit bias, right? But we have probably all, not probably, we have all perpetuated it. So we have all breathed the smog. I was just telling Sue that I had a really interesting experience with one of my fraternity brothers last night where like it was an implicit bias and it wasn't the time to like redress it then, but I have to, right? So like even in my own in-group, I had to face an implicit bias. So like for the duration of this session, I just want us to put on our hats to say, we have all been victims, but we have all perpetuated because that's how we learn how to eliminate, mitigate, and redress it.
I wanted to mention something that I saw on a newscast the other night. They were talking about, I think it was California or something, coming out with a regulation about not being biased against people with certain hairstyles. And initially when I heard that, I thought about it and I said, why hair? Why are they doing that? But then I realized like the people who, like, I'll use my son, he lost his job during COVID and
I'm sorry to hear that.
And he's very well educated, have a lot of experience, and he always had high paying jobs. He gets all these interviews. He comes to the third interview, you know, they done cut and he's down and he never gets it. And, you know, and the other day he told me, he said, Mom, I got a skin now. I cut all my hair off. And so he's thinking maybe that's the area. He wants to look like Dr. McGowan instead of Burrell, you know. And so he's thinking that you putting your head on Dr. McGowan. He's thinking that may be the bias is because he has the education, he has the experience, and he gets to the final 2 or 3 finals and then they pick someone else. And so he said, I'm going to skin my hair. And so he said, I'm going to see how that works. But I just wanted to bring that in as something that we commonly don't think about. Our hair may be an issue for some people with bias.
I appreciate you sharing that. Unfortunately, right? Like I have been in spaces with Black women who have said, you know what, until it became a fad for the Kardashians, I didn't want to wear braids because I thought that people would think it was less professional. Or I remember even at like Morehouse, when you were in the business school, they did not want Black men to have braids. Or I often hear about Black women being asked about their hair. So like, unfortunately, like hair also comes from socialization and people have faced implicit bias around that. We're actually going to watch a video from a Black woman who is going to talk courageously about how she's going to interrupt bias.
Okay. And while you are watching, we're asking for you to think about these questions. How does her experience demonstrate implicit bias on both a personal and systemic level? What is the evidence that folks involved have breathed in that smog? And does anyone in her experience recognize and redress bias? If so, what does it take to redress it? Let me know if you can hear it.
Throughout the time that I'm talking to you and after this talk is done, and when you find yourself in debates with people and you find yourself getting agitated, I want you to remember one very simple thing: that you have never locked eyes with another person who is not worthy of freedom, of liberty, of connection, and of belonging. I'm going to start by telling you a story of an experience that happened to me several years ago. I went to the courthouse to argue a motion. There was a partner of mine that was with me. We get to the courthouse. We have to argue the motions in chambers. One of the two opposing counsels came up and joined us, and as we were walking down, I'm stopped. A sheriff's deputy yells out to me, ma'am, you can't go back there. Ma'am, you can't go back there. And so I pause, I go towards him, and in this interaction, he essentially tells me, you can't go back there because this area is for attorneys only. And so I pause, I smile, and I tell him I'm an attorney. He doesn't believe me. You're an attorney? Let me see your bar card. I pause again, I smile. I show him my bar card. My partner who was with me was a white male, and he chose to take out his bar card and show his bar card as well. And in that moment, the atmosphere changed. Because then the sheriff's deputy began to look at me, my partner, and he realized what he'd done. There were 3 of us. He only asked for proof from 1. At that moment, opposing counsel who was with us, also a white male, began to say, you can take my word for it, we're all attorneys here, we're all attorneys here.
All right, let's talk about it. How does her experience demonstrate implicit bias on just a personal level? You can hop off mute and just talk.
One of the ways is that she had to prove to the gentleman that she was an attorney. You know, she had to reach down in her bag, and really he was actually speaking or addressing her, even though we didn't see that person, but probably he was looking at her, particularly saying that you can't go through there. So the fact that she was the one who had to produce or felt the need to produce to prove herself. But that
she does
happens
not.
all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. It's a lot of folks' daily truths, right? She doesn't look like a lawyer to this man. So then what is his idea about what a lawyer looks like?
Right.
Okay. Thank you. What about systemic bias? How does this type of bias play out on a systemic level?
Also, it brings out the question of what do Black people do at the courthouse?
That's powerful.
So what role did he think she might have been playing? Like, she's not a lawyer, so why is she at this courthouse?
She's a criminal.
What stereotypes? She's a criminal, or she's a little dressed up. She could be someone's mother there to, support her child who's a criminal, but just not there to work. Anybody else have thoughts
Even if
about
he didn't say it, maybe he's subconscious, and really the deep belief is, what's the role of Black people at a courthouse?
And this is how it plays out, right? He doesn't say it explicitly, but we can infer. Right. And so systemically, we see this play out, right? Black people and their bodies are constantly policed, right? Not just from law enforcement, but even regular people who are like, I don't think you belong here. Show me your ID. Show me that you belong at the pool house. And then, oh, I don't believe you. Who am I going to call? I'm going to call the police, because they are going to support my supremacy, my authority to tell you whether you belong. Who has breathed in this?
Sorry to interrupt you, but this is systematic because this is also the narrative that we're being told. And I watched a really powerful video on Facebook just a week or 2 ago. It was posted by Anthony Brock. Very well done. And it follows like three, there's some Black teens, there's a mother and her young children, and then there's a man. And it's the story, and he says, and what do you think happens next? And that's where the implicit bias comes in, because the narrative is all really positive things. And his message was, you know, in media and in the storytellings, it's always being told from a negative perspective. So like when you look at what's the role in the courthouse, that's the narrative, you know, that you see on television, that you see on movies, and that's where it's systematic.
And that's our smog, right?
Right.
That's the stuff that everybody breathes in, whether we want to or not. Thank you guys so much for your insights. Did anybody tackle the question? Uh, did anyone in the story recognize and redress the bias?
Yes, I think the person who took out his card to show that he was a lawyer realized that, you know, this was going on, and that I'm going to respond in the way to kind of bring it down a little, you know. Now, the other man that says, you know, all of us are lawyers, you can take my word for it. You know, his thing was he was still promoting the bias. Because I'm white and I say it, it's okay. And he probably didn't even realize he was doing that. But he's saying to another, you know, and that's what I found as a woman of color, is that if you're in certain positions of authority, or you're near the glass ceiling, that sometimes you have to be kissed off by somebody white, somebody that says she knows what she's talking about, or you can listen to her. You know, it's not.
Because I said so.
Yeah, they have to set you up. You just can't come in. You know, like I used to work for a think tank in Washington, D.C. And when I would go to Congress and say something, or I would go somewhere, somebody wanted to set me up first. You know, they didn't have as much information as I had about the particular topic, but they were white.
Yeah.
Wow. Folks, we have just shared a ton of awesome insights. We have more writing and talking and discussions lined up in the workshop. So we're not trying to like dead the movement. Like I can talk about this all workshop long, but then y'all gonna say, well, what about we didn't get to? So if we can pause for a minute and hold our ideas and see if we can tie them in at the next discussion topic. The next piece is super important because we don't want to just talk about the world and the smog out there. We want to look about how this has impacted our work and our lives. So the next prompt I want you to do some writing about is to describe a time when you yourself have demonstrated a bias against someone else. Right? We all breathe in the smog. So we all need to think about, well, what's my particular bias? And how that bias shows up in larger systems and institutions. All right, take a minute to write. Okay, all right, let's talk iceberg. I think that this iceberg image is really appropriate when we talk about implicit bias, largely because most people do not want to address or acknowledge their own implicit biases, because to do so sort of conflicts with this image of this fair person that we all want to be. And so, you know, like any iceberg, if you've studied a little bit of psychology, right, the tip of the iceberg is our consciousness. It is essentially how we hope to show up at our work and around our colleagues or our students, et cetera. But below the surface is our unconscious, and that actually represents all of those drivers that influence our behavior, which impact how people actually experience us. Now, whenever I do this workshop, someone says, but it's my unconscious. Like, what can I do about my unconscious? I can't change that behavior. Well, I will posit that recognizing and redressing bias is about building that greater awareness, examining some hard truths about ourselves, and then lastly, taking accountability for how other people experience us. So we're not going to focus as much on the intention behind your actions, but on how they impacted other people. Let me try to say it another way. All right. Tip of the iceberg is how we want to show up at work for our colleagues and our students. Below the iceberg, the repression, the fears, the insecurities, the traumas, the reflexes, that represents the things that get in the way of the way we want to show up at work. So when I was an educator, I told everybody about I wanted to be this understanding, caring educator. I wanted to reach every single student that I taught. However, I did have some traumatic experiences around vulnerability, and that impacted how I showed up for my most vulnerable students. When I think about the way they experience me as their teacher, I have to just take some accountability for like, that's not how I wanted it to play, but I got to deal with my stuff first. Okay, I've given you a lot of personal information and I've talked a bit. I want you to get a chance to do some reflection. Um, on page 3 of your handout, it asks 2 questions. At the beginning of every academic year, what are your goals and intentions? What are you seeking to set out and to be? How do you want to show up at work? And then if you look below the iceberg, what gets in your way? Take a few minutes to reflect. Okay. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Burrell in just a second, just to talk about how these unconscious elements here, these habits that we have that we're not necessarily so aware of, how they actually lead to us enacting bias in our lives.
Awesome. Thank you, Sue. So when I think about implicit bias, right, it's connected to this larger realm of socialization. It doesn't just come out of the clouds, right? We have been socialized to think lots of things. So if you are fearful of the Black man that's walking down the street and you clutch your bag, it's because you've been socialized to think that Black men are aggressive, right? So we develop unconscious habits, which are connected to unquestioned beliefs and prejudices, automatic filterings, and then we have these self-protective scripts. You can go to the, yep. I want you to begin to think about how do these habits lead to bias and impact our work? So we have these deep-seated unquestioned beliefs and prejudices around specific groups. How do we treat the students and faculty that we interact with? How does this impact my work on the daily? If you think that Black women are promiscuous, you're less likely to put them in leadership roles because you already have this implicit bias around their behavior. So I'm going to be super vulnerable, right? I come from abject poverty, grew up in Philadelphia. My grandparents raised me. And I worked really, really hard. I bought into the idea of meritocracy, earned scholarships to go to Columbia and Harvard. Decided I wanted to be a teacher. Got that at bat. I was a 7th grade history teacher. So I came in like the only way to make it, right? My implicit bias was that all students should go to college directly after high school, especially the Black ones, right? Like, you better go to college directly after high school. That was my implicit bias because I was working for a high performance charter school where the motto was go to college, go to college, go to college. Because of that, I had some automatic filtering. I began to silence student voice and begin to elevate the mission of like, the charter school that I work for, my own implicit bias around like what it means to be successful in the world. I had a 7th grader who was so bright and he was a great writer and he was a great thinker and he was good at math. And when he told me that he wanted to be a mechanic, I was like, a mechanic? Why do you want to do that? Like, you can do something better. I was 23 years old and I had this implicit bias that if you didn't want to go to college, that you were taking the easy route and you were lazy. So that began to show up how I treated students who did not buy into my idea of what it meant to be successful. And I had these self-protective scripts, like, you need to be shooting for that white coat. You need to be getting those 3 letters behind your name, that EDD, that PhD, right? And I said, my students can trust me. I come from the same racial and same socioeconomic background as them. You need to trust me as the gatekeeper. My implicit bias is right. In order to be successful and to escape poverty and to be a successful Black person, that you have to go to college directly after high school. That 7th grader that wanted to be a mechanic, he now works in my car and he has one of the most successful businesses in Philadelphia. I was wrong. So I want you to begin to think about the unconscious habits that lead to implicit bias that we have. Um, and I want you to begin to think about how do these habits lead to bias and impact our work. They were unconscious. I pushed my students to write better, think. I made sure they had culturally relevant like readings, and unconsciously I thought I was doing a good thing, right? To say like, here's what you need to do. So I want you to begin to think about your own implicit bias and think about how these unconscious habits that you are carrying are impacting, are leading to implicit bias, and then therefore impacting the work that you do at your institutions. So what we're going to do is watch another video. Can you go back one slide, Sue? Thank you. And I want you to listen to Karu talk again, right? And this time I want you to listen for examples of these unconscious elements. Like, what are the unquestioned beliefs and prejudices that she's faced, right? The automatic filterings and the self-protective scripts.
Is that on the day that this happened, I was flooded with anger and with a warmth that went along with embarrassment and humiliation. That as I was standing there and I paused again and smiled again and held my tongue again, choosing not to point out the inconsistency, that my inner voice was telling me, don't get too loud, use your low voice. Because if you start talking loud, they'll say you sound shrill or worse, hysterical. We've all heard that one. And so I have to navigate this stereotype of the angry Black woman. And you know who she is. You've seen her on TV. She's that woman that some people see anytime a Black woman has an opinion, says her mind, shows passion, or questions the status quo. Stop. Stop. See, this is the place when stories like this are shared that the blustery and sometimes contemptuous responses begin. This is when people begin to say things like, well, you don't know that this had anything to do with race. He didn't say that he stopped you because you were Black. Or, what's the problem? They're supposed to check everybody who goes back there towards Chambers. He had the right to check you. Or, law enforcement have a very tough job. They put their lives at risk to keep us safe. And whatever they ask you to do, you just need to do it. We hear those responses. We hear the responses where people say, here we go, again. Another person of color talking about race, again. Oh, a minority playing the race card.
Awesome. So what I wanted to do, remember, one of our big goals is for us to continue to own our own development, and that requires us to continue to look inward. So I want you to think about the unconscious habits that I talked about, and then Corey Carew courageously talked about. And I want you to think about how have you enacted one of the following unconscious habits in your work as an educator / colleague, as it specifically relates to like race, class, gender. I'm more than willing to open it up. How is this an example of bias on a personal level? And then what was the impact? I will give you 3 minutes on the clock. Thank you so much for that like deep introspection. And as we continue with our session, I want you to constantly think about the unconscious habits that you have, that you own, right? And how it leads to bias, and then the impact that it has on the work, your students, your colleagues, and so forth and so on.
Okay. We're going to transition on to the big part, right? We've talked about recognizing bias, and now what do we do about it? Okay. I want to pause and recap our work. We know that cultural competence is this ongoing, continuous work as we try to understand and respect difference. We tend to look at it in a two-pronged approach. There's this building awareness about ourselves, reflecting on identities and experiences that influence how we interact with other people who are different from us. So that's kind of what we've been digging into so far. Now it's time for the practice, the experience, the trial and error. You know, what do we say? How do we do it? Making mistakes and being okay with that. So that's why we have those norms to lean into. We will make mistakes, but we'll push on. We found this cool video about Valerie Alexander giving practical strategies on how to like outsmart your unconscious brain. So we're going to watch hers and try to identify what are those 3 strategies she's articulating.
But the amygdala, that's been there since the earliest records of human existence. When it encounters the unexpected, it floods your system with stress hormones. Fight or flight is what kept our species alive for millions of years. None of us in 100 lifetimes will ever be able to change that trigger inside our brains. So our only solution is to change what's outside our brains, to consciously turn the unexpected into the expected so that we don't have unconscious hormonal reactions that keep our society from moving forward. How do you do that? How do you change the unexpected to the expected? Well, there are 3 things you can try. 1, as you go about your day, visualize situations before they happen. The meeting you're about to walk into, the new doctor you're seeing, the driver you just pulled over for having a broken taillight. And whatever mental picture you get, change it. Open yourself to different possibilities. The second thing, when we do encounter the unexpected, have the courage to examine your own behavior. Ask yourself, is this how I would handle this interaction if this person looked like me? Or if this person didn't look like me? Third, make a conscious effort to expose yourself and your children and others to that which is currently unexpected and doesn't need to be. Hire the employees, patronize the businesses, vote for the candidates who have earned the position and are also challenging the norms. There are enormous and long-ranging consequences when we can change the unexpected to the expected. Consider this. We have 2 entire generations in the world whose first visual image of a United States president is black. It doesn't matter what kind of hate or ugliness might have been spoken in their homes, that picture is always within the realm of the expected for them. We normalize things by making them expected.
Okay. So again, the strategies or practices she has on tricking your brain and changing your behavior. Visualize situations before they happen and change what you're going to expect to see. Examine your behavior when you're interacting with someone and think if you would be acting the same way if this person looked the same or differently from you. And try your best on a daily to expose yourself to things and people who are different from you. Okay, let's apply. So you should have this chart on your handout, page 4. We're going to ask you to think about that bias that you acknowledged early on that you've demonstrated towards others. And for that pocket of folks who earlier were like, I'm not sure, we're hoping at this point you are able to pinpoint and recognize a bias that you've demonstrated. Think about the 3 practices to addressing the bias, and then write down and reflect on what that would look like in your work and in your life. Okay, good people, that is time. We want to open up the floor for one person from the team to just talk about how they plan to implement the visualization, examining, or normalizing practices in their work. Don't be shy. We want to hear from you.
I guess basically just change our narrative, change our way of thinking, and step out of our comfort zone and out of our box. So if when we're seeing things that are different or something that's a change that we may have a bias against, just kind of stop for a minute and, like it says, examine, think about it, and yeah, just normalize it. Just yeah.
Thank you
are
so
out
much for stepping out there. Sorry. There was a bit of a delay for me. Sorry. Thank you for just laying out there and speaking up. Would you feel comfortable sharing like what the biases that you recognize within yourself?
Yes, mine's kind of corny. Let me take my mask off. Nobody's in here. Mine's is a little corny.
Safe
I
space.
have a thing about smiling. I just feel a little more at ease when people smile or has kind of like a little sense of humor, I guess, as opposed to someone that does. And I know you can't see that right away, I guess, from a distance or something. Well, I can. I just think a smile is more welcoming, and I'm a little intimidated if someone's just frowned up all the time or kind of mean spirited, I guess. So mine's a little corny.
So you, identify with folks who present in a particular affect. And if someone does not present that way, you might find yourself changing your behavior
Yes.
as you respond to interact with that person.
Correct.
So how can we get better at normalizing that other folks have different affects? How could you get greater exposure to that?
I think I've worked with it. I've tried to work with it just to take myself out of that thinking. And even if someone's not smiling, you smile at them. If you may be intimidated or you might think someone's quote unquote mean or aggressive, whatever, just kill them with kindness. Goes a long ways.
Exactly. And I just push you to just like you said, to just engage and see before you make the judgment that they're going to be this type of way. Lean in and get information before we draw the judgment of like, oh, they're this kind of person. I say that because I am like my face is a sort of a frowny face, and people get to know me and say, oh, you're really like nice or funny or sweet. So
Right.
folks with these faces appreciate having the opportunity to show you who they are.
Yeah, thank you. And I
Thank you so
apologize,
much.
you all. I just had to get my COVID test and then I'm getting ready for a class. So that's why I'm kind of in and out. But I'm listening to you guys.
We
Thank
appreciate
you.
you. Thank you so much. All right, we have one final scenario for you. Um, what would you do, right? This is like real life. Let's imagine that we all mentor a student who happens to be a native English speaker, and we're talking with a colleague who's saying to us, oh, thank you for recommending Maria to our program. She's been a great asset to the group, and she speaks and writes in perfect English. Why is this an example of implicit bias? How do you redress your colleague? Right. We're going to take, I know it says 3, we're going to push to 2 minutes to write down what we would say and why it is biased.
Joanne wrote something in the chat. I would love for her to talk about like what she wrote and just share with the group. I think she brings up a really important point.
I would write back to the person or perhaps call them and say, well, why shouldn't she? And then see what that person would say in response, and maybe or I wouldn't say, why did you assume she wouldn't? But I would just say, why wouldn't she? And then maybe add the other languages that Maria might speak. I've asked my students, I don't want to take too much time, raise your hand if you can speak more than one language. And many speak 2 and 3. And there's assumptions that are made all the time. And we're the only monolingual country in the world. And that's the only thing I wanted to say. But it would be very, why wouldn't she?
Thank you so much for sharing out. Other voices about how you would address this colleague, because there is no one single way.
So I posted that this is a big one for us at SDSU. I'm at San Diego State University. So not only are we the largest university close to the border in Southern California, but we also just have a very diverse population in San Diego. And so our students are usually often bilingual, multilingual. And yet we have to constantly address this, like in our supervisor trainings, because we have this bias that the student teachers need to be writing in perfect English all of the time. And that really shouldn't be the expectation. When you have the ability to speak multi-languages, there are going to be imperfections. I speak English as my first language and I have imperfections, right? And so perfect English, either written or spoken, should not be a way that we are what's the word I'm looking for? Assessing someone And so even in like formal assessments for like Ed TPA, Cal TPA, you can't look at the written language as the indicator of success and the indicator of good teaching.
And that's something that you would share with your colleague.
I have to share that like on a monthly basis.
Interesting, interesting.
This
Well,
is
thank you.
just an added comment if I can. Sometimes the way we say things, and in the chat box, I said, watch the quotation marks. You know, we have quotation marks for reasons. And the way she expressed herself to me was almost an indication that she wasn't really expected. That's the hidden bias that she really wasn't, may not have been expected. So now I'm sharing with the group. Wow. I don't say wow, but it's like, wow. She speaks perfect and writes perfect English. And welcome Maria to our program. She is such an asset to the group. So sometimes actions and the way we express ourselves speaks louder than the print.
And I see in the chat, Monica is adding on good questions about why are we even assuming that Maria is bilingual? Like all the assumptions that we're carrying. Yeah.
So, and if I can just speak about this, because this is really the bias that I've been exposed to the most, being a first generation immigrant to this country. And I do see several problems with this. First of all, it says here, Maria is a native English speaker. So why are we even assuming she's bilingual? My husband's name is Pablo. He doesn't speak Spanish. So that's the first bias right there. The second is, and this is my personal experience, asking anyone or saying that anyone speaks and writes perfect English, I agree with everybody else in here. But then I create and develop and present multiple professional development sessions. And one of the things that I have encountered throughout my life here in the United States is a question of accent as it equates to intelligence. And whether a person speaks with an accent makes them less and more capable of having an intelligent conversation. So so that is one of the bias that I have encountered, continue to encounter. And one of the ways that I redress, and it might not be the best, has always been, and I have to say this, I've been put in that situation where I have to say, I might speak with an accent, but I don't think with one. Or just because my speech comes out with an accent, that doesn't mean that my brain has one. And sometimes people do take a step back and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I wonder how many that are in classrooms in front of kids do that and think that way.
Thank you so much for sharing your truth and for just having that courage to speak up and speak out against this thing that people experience and are impacted by all their lives. If you belong to particular marginalized groups, we're going to close out with Corliss before we go on to wrap up and do our survey. Corliss?
And I wanted to piggyback on something that Monica said. It was the name for me, assuming that she was bilingual, but it's the bias in names. It's just like why, as a Black parent, I was very cautious, for lack of a better word, of what I named my children. Because we know that names can get you pushed out of jobs. And it's always interesting when I show up to places because nobody really is quite sure who I am based just on my name. And it happens with my husband as well, and now our children. And so I think, yes, it does disproportionately impact people of color. We chose the names because we liked them, but we also, in the back of our heads, that was something we thought about. How are people going to look at this name on a resume, and what are they going to assume?
This is why it's so dangerous and
Mhm.
so tedious. Thank
Mhm.
everybody just who lit up this discussion, whether it's in the chat or verbally or just took it in. We appreciate you. We are wrapping up the workshop, hoping that we were successful at getting us to talk about how elements of our unconscious leads to biased behavior, giving you some strategies on how you can trick your brain to think a different way and steer clear of bias, and ways to talk through and redress bias. If Burrell, if you can drop the link to our survey in the chat. We really value your feedback. We use it to grow. Literally, we read and pour over all the feedback. So we just would love it if we can get 100% feedback from folks. Dr. Long, is there any announcements for the team or?
No, thank you everyone so much for being here and spending your time with us today and choosing to be a part of this workshop. We really appreciate all of you. And thank you so much to the center for presenting. Every time I come here, I learn something new and I am reflecting on a different bias. And I just appreciate Sue and Mikal, all the work that you've done today. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Please stay safe. You and your families have an amazing end to your academic career. And if you please, put your emails in the box if you want to stay in touch. And yeah, it's always a pleasure.